All right, everyone, welcome back to the Kyle Anslone Show. And I have something I'm really excited about today. Bringing on this show for the first time, one of my great colleagues at the Libertarian Institute, Keith Knight. Keith, you are the managing editor at the Institute, and of course, the host of the Don't Tread on Anyone, which is a fantastic show. I really recommend people check it out. I really like the way Keith edits and puts together those shows. They flow so well. And then, of course, he's written a couple books now, including the Voluntarist Handbook. So, Keith, how you doing today? What's happening in out there in Arizona?
Not a whole lot specifically in Arizona. I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me on. The other day, I caught your discussion with the American surgeon working in Gaza. Just fantastic material. Thank you so much for taking the time to put that out for us to enjoy.
Well, thank you. And I think we'll have another good one here today. I got a few topics I want to talk to you about and eventually get to some of your expertise on Winston Churchill, because I know this is such a interesting topic. But I want to get some of your thoughts on hate speech versus free speech, data collection, and Donald Trump in his first 4 months in office. So at the Libertarian Institute recently, we ran this article from Connor Freeman, a colleague of ours, on GOP representative introducing a resolution that labels Free Palestine as a slogan as anti Semitism. And what Connor explains is that Colorado Congressman Gabe Evans introduced a non binding resolution on Friday that labels Free Palestine as an anti Semitic slogan. The bill seeks to limit immigration of people who oppose Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine and Tel Aviv's genocidal onslaught in the besieged Gaza Strip. The bill is expected to be voted on sometime next week. And the actual text says, while shouting Free Palestine, an anti Semitic slogan, a terrorist, I guess, called for the destruction of Israel and the Jewish people. And so, Keith, I'm wondering, I guess, your thoughts, particularly from the libertarian perspective, on is it the role of government to be getting in and trying to decide what particular speech is hateful and what is allowed under our First Amendment and Bill of Rights?
I think one of the most important things about the Ron Paul meme that's known as Ron Paul was right about everything, one of the important aspects of Ron Paul, looking back, is that when he looked at a piece of legislation, what he looked at was the incentives that politicians and police officers would face when it came to interpreting that piece of legislation. Whereas people more commonly, when it came to the war on terror, when it came to the bailouts of 2008, when it came to the COVID crisis, they would just look at the alleged intentions of that legislation. So if we take this general formula of looking at the intentions that are given to the state, or the incentives rather, as opposed to the intentions, what incentive do politicians have to make sure the right speech is said in such a way that could produce whatever desired outcome they want? Is it that they want an outcome that only produces peaceful, harmonious actions among their citizens? Is the goal for us to always get the truth? Is it for us to always be engaged in peaceful activities amongst one another? We don't even know what the alleged goal is in stopping this hate speech, as it's called. So, what they always say is, well, we're doing it to protect the lives of other people. Notice there is another side to this pancake, no matter how flat they try and make it, that by silencing some people, you're increasing the amount of hostility they have with not only the people around them, but the ICE agents in the case of LA and the politicians who claim the right to rule them in the first place. Remember, Kyle, we might have to go to nuclear war with Russia based on who gets to control the Donbass region, because that's a potential violation of our freedom. First he'll take the Donbass, then Putin takes Ukraine, then Eastern Europe, then Western Europe, then South America, then Mexico, then he'll take over America. That's why we need to be willing to go to war over the Donbass region. But when politicians explicitly come out and say, we have a better claim to the words that come out of your mouth than you do, well, that's just up for debate, and we might have to blindly obey those laws. So immediately we're seeing the politicians, they don't have a good incentive to produce desirable legislation when it comes to how to interpret hate speech versus not hate speech. They could actually start with people like Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth. You know what I consider hate speech? When the US government already spends $800 billion a year making us less safe by provoking enemies around the world with the Pentagon, they want to increase it to have our first $1 trillion budget. That is some of the most hateful speech that I've come across, not to mention the hate speech around murdering people in Iran, murdering people in Gaza, murdering people in Afghanistan, murdering people in Iraq, saying that we have to fund moderate rebels because, taxpayers just haven't chipped in enough for the government this year. That is much more qualifying as hate speech than anything that I could think of. So, no, of course not. The government should not be interpreting this. Why? Because it can be so broadly interpreted and they don't have the proper incentives as to what they could accurately categorize as genuine threats and hate speech and that which is necessary to communicate true statements to the population.
This case, the particular case of Free Palestine that we have going on right now, the argument is going to be that by allowing that to be said, it's going to incite violence against Jewish people here in the United States, and that's why we have to tamp down on this speech. It doesn't really have anything to do with Israel. It's all about combating, and I guess there have been in recent months a couple of crimes that were committed where the murderer assassin did say, pro Palestinian slogans as he committed those crimes. And so, does that then give the government the right to legislate?
Immediately, one of the good rules of thumb when coming across new legislation is to see if this could be applied consistently. So if I say murder, rape, and kidnapping should be illegal, you could say, well, does that apply to whites, blacks, rich people, men, women? And you have no problem applying those principles consistently, saying, yeah, these things are inherently bad. But when it comes to something like, well, these words were good 2 years ago, you could have said them. But now that a microscopic percentage of people have used those words, along with a million others, while committing an act of violence, we're now justified in restricting all speech for all people in America. That's the level of mind control they have the population under. This is the result of what, 12 years of state education? People can't even see this clearly. No, saying free Palestine is not enough to categorize something as incitement. The analogy that they will use as well is getting a tattoo immoral. No, not necessarily. Well, what if it's in a certain shape that other gang members have? And what if this is your attempt to display your allegiance to the gang? Shouldn't we get people, once they've displayed their allegiance by getting the gang tattoo or by saying the free Palestine, that's enough for us to start rounding them up? The problem is that free Palestine can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. I frankly am not exactly sure what a lot of progressives say when Greta Thunberg is advocating tyranny in Western countries, yet wants to free Palestine. I don't know. I'm assuming they just mean stop the Israeli blockade because they've been saying it for a while. But now it could totally mean just stop bombing the hell out of the place. If you look at that camera footage, there was drone footage released by Al Jazeera in the town of Rafah. It quite literally looks like an ethnic cleansing mass murder operation writ large. And that's what Theo Vaughn is showing as he's, saying, I don't know much about this issue, but Jesus, this seems like a genocide. This seems like one of the worst things I've ever come across. And to Theo Vaughn's credit, you don't really need to have a lot of information on something when you see such a blatant atrocity. If I said there was a rape, there was a kidnapping, there was a mass shooting, there was, human trafficking, without getting into all the details, you can clearly see something and say that is inherently unjustifiable due to the massive amount of suffering that it costs. There's an old adage that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. One of the things the American people should start embracing is extraordinary violations of the non aggression principle. Maybe that'll be hard to get them to agree with. Extraordinary amounts of violence require extraordinary justification, meaning before we engage or justify mass murder and mass ethnic cleansing and mass destruction of housing, places that took decades to build, before doing that, you better have such a strong justification. You should have gone through every single non lethal method of achieving your ends peacefully before doing something like that. And of course, we don't have anything close to that. In fact, you have places like the Times of Israel and Haaretz saying that, really the entire October 7th thing that we're using as the justification for what we're doing in Gaza, if we had had better border security, none of this would have happened in the first place. We wouldn't have even had to unleash the Hannibal Directive later on October 7th. So I think there's generally no justification for any of this. Another unintended consequence is if you say, well, the statement Free Palestine will lead to people hating and killing Jews. Well, another thing that could lead to people hating and killing Jews is occupying Gaza and the West Bank and expanding settlements. And that could also lead to it. So you might want to look into stopping those things. Also, something that might cause incitement to violence against a certain demographic is when they have a particular monopoly, more or less, on not being able to be publicly criticized. That could create a heck of a lot of hostility. There's an old expression that if you want to see who's in power, look who you can't criticize. So if there's a law that explicitly says you can't criticize this demographic, that could incite far more violence than giving people the freedom to say free Palestine. So no, I oppose this unequivocally.
Answer, Keith. Next up, I want to move on and ask you a question about this article that I wrote last week for the Libertarian Institute. The Trump administration is looking and gearing up. They've tapped Palantir for a government-wide database surveilling Americans. And now some people, and I even saw some people who say they're libertarians on it, Keith, said this is a good thing. This is going to make the government more efficient, right? And as libertarians, we should want the government to, operate at an efficiency that's like cheaper to do things, and that they don't have massive blunders, right? And so, as a libertarian, is this something that you're celebrating, or does this horrify you as it does me?
Again, I would look back at the incentives that organizations face when they have the capacity to collect massive amounts of data. So, when Google or Apple collects large amounts of data on Americans, as they do, as Amazon does, as every time you go to a website, they ask for cookie access to your data. It's really important that this organization, these big organizations, Facebook, Google, Twitter, X, YouTube, that if they have access to all this data, make sure they also don't have access to a police force, which can put you in jail, to a military, which has the right to conscript you, to an education system, which has a monopoly right to engage in compulsory education for the youth of your entire country. So, generally speaking, there is not anything wrong with people exchanging data for a product or service. I'm glad that X is free and Grok is free on X now, as far as I know, for millions of people to use. And what they do is they sacrifice some data. People have access to Google Maps, which they could use in any amount totally free, so long as they have a Google account. But Google basically gets to know where you go and how long you spend there. So giving your data to people should be based on consent, more or less. Each individual has to weigh the costs and benefits. Sometimes people say, the idea of a free Gmail account is incredible. I can communicate with billions of people over electronic mail instead of physical mail. It saves money, it saves time, it's just so efficient. But I do have to weigh the costs of giving Google my information, and they could basically see who I'm talking to. So, in general, there's nothing wrong with exchanging data for free products and services, getting to watch YouTube videos, getting a Facebook account. This is completely different. This is not an organization, the government operating with Palantir. What they're essentially doing is claiming the right for the private company to have access to all the data, and the state, who has a right to put you in jail, they're now merging these two institutions. So, whereas originally you could just give someone your information or opt out of it or use a virtual private network, now that is no longer an option for people to opt out of. So, because the state does not face the market discipline of competitors, one, and most importantly, the freedom to disassociate when organizations go rogue or are no longer providing value, as good as Blockbuster was, something better came along, so people switched. So the fact that the government does not face this incentive to provide good service means it's uniquely different, and that's why the government should not be collecting data. Remember, it was like a total violation of our rights for people to voluntarily get a TikTok account, install the app. That was made illegal essentially by the Joe Biden administration and then was negotiated out of by Donald Trump. But remember, people voluntarily getting the TikTok app was a violation because people didn't know what was happening on their screens. They didn't know where their data was going. Well, now the government is explicitly coercing the data out of you, and you don't have any recourse if you no longer find value in the product or service they're providing. As much as you could hate Google, Facebook, or YouTube, if I ever stop liking what they're providing, one, I could delete all of my information at least without having to sell my house or go to prison. But there's also competitors, and they don't have the capacity to put me in jail if they don't like what I'm saying. That's why it's so much worse when the state does it as opposed to a voluntary organization. I had a gentleman on my show, and he said, well, if you're dealing with a big corporation, it's not that different than dealing with a big government, both big, both powerful, both have the capacity to change the trajectory of your life. So, that they're big in both areas, and they could be they could go rogue and really inconvenience you. So they're more or less the same. One of the best ways to diffuse such nonsense is to say, well, since big corporations and big government are basically the same, let's just give corporations all the rights that governments have. Let's give Amazon and Walmart the right to start issuing taxes on people's income. Let's give them the right to tell people what can be built in what areas with zoning laws. Let's give them the right to conscript people to work for them against their will. We'll give them the right to educate the population, everyone ages 5 to 18, and we'll give Walmart and Amazon the right to declare war on people based on their geographical area, start murdering people and putting them in prison for not following Amazon or Walmart laws that, the board of directors on these companies writes. I mean, since big government and big corporations are no different, then this wouldn't change much at all, just giving these corporations the exact same rights that governments have. And then immediately you see, well, I guess I've been propagandized into this because if there was no difference, then extending the rights that the state has to the corporations wouldn't be so significant. Of course, we see it is.
So one thing that's come up in some pushback that I've gotten, which I find to be a little bit funny, but I'm interested in your take on it, is that now you have a situation where members of the U.S. intelligence community, the CIA, NSA, even law enforcement, local law enforcement, or national law enforcement like the FBI, are actually going to Meta, going to Google, and buying your data from them. Now, it would seem to me that how could you buy the data that's essentially bribing to go around getting a warrant? But that's what they're doing. So is this the free market that you envision, Keith, or what do you think's happening here?
Well, you have to be able to locate the ultimate culprit in where the issue lies. If we have information given to Facebook and then the information's given to the NSA or the FBI, as Mark Zuckerberg said on the Joe Rogan Experience, or in the case of Twitter, as was shown through the Twitter files, there was a great deal of White House interference in both Facebook and Twitter. We have every reason to believe that it's going on in YouTube. This is why it's so important for there to not be a $6.27 trillion treasure chest for psychopathic politicians to get a hold of. Because instead of just doing basic government functions, locking up the kidnappers, locking up the rapists, keeping the streets clean, instead of focusing on those things, which they seldom achieve in general, they then search for dragons to slay in other areas. And now, if you had a very small government that only had enough money or power to enforce very few things, then they would never dream of the capacity of being able to strong arm Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, any of these other organizations. So while Facebook is essentially a co conspirator in this interaction between getting your data and then selling it to the state, the problem is not that people have voluntary access to a Facebook account to meet people. The problem is there's a state that gets to collect money coercively and print money at will through the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. That's the ultimate culprit of the issue here.
The corruption with YouTube. If people want to help us, do what we can to beat that corruption, please subscribe to this YouTube channel. We are nearing having 1,000 subscribers, and so if you head on over to the channel and do that, it will definitely help us out and give us a little bit of a bump. Now, next up, Keith, I wanted to ask you about what you thought of Trump during his first few months in office, particularly this pledge that he made on his commitment to free speech.
Well,
And I have stopped all government censorship and brought back free speech in America. It's back.
well, I'm sorry, I started answering early. When it comes to TikTok, I thought he did an excellent job there. If you remember during his Joe Rogan appearance, he had said, TikTok's actually amazing. I think we have like 14 million followers on there. So it turns out you can harmonize interests even when you're dealing with lying psychopathic politicians. So when it comes to TikTok, I give him an absolute A plus. When it comes to befriending Elon Musk, initially I thought, hey, nothing terrible about this. So those are the good things. We have not had some institution of, what was it called? The Disinformation Governance Board that Nina Jankowicz was going to lead under Biden's administration. He hasn't had anything like that. So far, so good. However, he just gets a complete failing grade when it comes to claiming that some people don't have the right to protest or use certain words like free Palestine, or make the case that the people in Gaza would be justified in resisting Israeli occupation, or even if you support Hamas, anyone who supports Netanyahu, anyone who supports Harry Truman has just as much blood on their hands as someone supporting Hamas. What I think this is just a general attempt to see who a potential non-Trump supporting demographic is, and use a justification to exclude or oppress or weaken that demographic. Just as you would like a war on terrorism to justify further growing the government, you want a war on some group. If you're looking at things through Trump's lens, you want a war on some group. You want some domestic enemy that will justify expanding the power of the government domestically. So, in the case of, let me think of an example where you could, it's not like Richard Nixon had studied tons of drug science in his past and then got elected into office and then said these drugs are really hurting people and we have to ramp up enforcement to keep the population safe and make sure they're all healthy. What happened was you had a very inconvenient demographic who were the anti-war protesters under Richard Nixon, and you didn't want a law that said no protesting the Vietnam War, the bombing of Cambodia, Operation Menu, or any of these things. So what he did was he waged a war on drugs, took the very first steps, which were ramped up by both Reagan and Clinton eventually. It, that was their method of saying, it's this what we're going after. We're really going after the drugs, but it just is going to happen to be heavily enforced against people who are really inconvenient for us. If you read Executive Order 9066 by Franklin Roosevelt, this was the internment of Japanese Americans to the tune of 117,000, and then another 5,000 German and Italian immigrants. Um, it did not say, we hereby claim the right to round up people of Japanese descent. It doesn't mention the word Japanese at all, but they knew how it was going to be enforced because they had an inconvenient demographic and they wanted to expand their powers domestically. So when Trump says we're going back on our word for free speech, but not really, because we're only applying it to this really inconvenient, troublesome demographic, it's never going to affect you. I think we should be very wary. Overall, I would say, see, the thing about TikTok is you're expected to do that. You're expected to not ban apps people voluntarily use. So, but then I'd have to account for not having his version of the Disinformation Governance Board. I would give President Trump a C minus. That's how I'd grade him.
That seems kind of generous, Keith, but pretty fair. Now, I want to ask you a question, and this came up when I was on Judging Freedom with Andrew Napolitano last week, and the judge was kind of asking me about, and it seems like there's kind of conflicting views here for us libertarians. Where, in one sense, I am very much for ending all federal government funds going to Harvard and other, particularly like these elite universities with massive endowments. They don't need the taxpayer. They don't need your money to operate. This is absurd. At the same time, if he's only getting rid of that money to Harvard because they allowed too many free speech protests, this really seems to be an encroachment on the First Amendment. Likewise, I think you can make a very good libertarian argument against immigration. At the same time, if the standard for immigration is you can't talk bad about one particular country, and if that country was the United States of America, that might be compelling. But if it's the state of Israel, only the state of Israel, foreign government, that seems fairly concerning, in that you're trying to establish a society with a certain viewpoint on a certain issue by using this massive weight of the U.S. government. So would you be pro cutting Harvard's funding over this issue, or that Harvard should actually keep that money because this is an encroachment on the First Amendment?
I would cut all federal funding to, well, ideally any college, but if you could only get that for one college, I would. Unfortunately, there is the incentive of, well, what is their real motive behind doing this? And unfortunately, you have to come across that. But when it comes to Harvard having billions of dollars in endowments, the sooner you could start chipping away at this, the better. And it could be used as an example in the future of, hey, federal funding was cut to Harvard. Let's see if we could do Yale next. Let's see about Princeton, Stanford. Let's see if we could privatize all education. Considering I've gotten a better education from the Kyle Anzalone show and Wikipedia and archive.org than I ever got at government schools, maybe that'll start moving things in the right direction. It is very difficult when you know there's an explicit motive, and this is just an enemy of the current regime who has to take the brunt of something. You don't want to give them the victory. But in this case, with Harvard, I think certainly that would cutting funding from them is like any socialist historically would have said, well, we need a state for the poor and the downtrodden. And it's like, how many impoverished, downtrodden people are going to Harvard? Like, Harvard access is a basic human right since the days of like George Bernard Shaw all the way through Alexandria Ocasio Cortez. Now people have a total positive right to an Ivy League elite education, which after 4 years produces very unimpressive results, anyways. So I would support cutting funding from even one school, ideally two, ideally three, maybe all of them eventually. But if all I could get is one, that's a victory in the short run, I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, these questions are, I think, hard to answer for libertarians because it meets the, reality with our philosophy, and the state never gives you the option to follow your philosophy. Now, Keith, before we wrap up here, I want to move on and ask you about World War II propaganda. And this is really so important because it's the foundation of a lot of the propaganda, right? Everybody's Hitler who's bad, everybody who's good is Churchill. And so you have this recent episode of Don't Tread on Anyone, and Douglas Murray is wrong, and you could really just end the title there, but he's also wrong about Churchill, and you could explain why. And so what in particular did he say that was wrong about Churchill, and why is it important, Keith?
I'll start with why it's important. I don't think I've seen a single discussion about the Russia Ukraine war, about the Gaza Israeli. I don't even think you could call that a war. The Israeli operation in Gaza is the most accurate, most charitable thing to call it. I haven't seen a single discussion about either of those two topics where at some point someone defending the Israeli regime or the Ukrainian regime didn't invoke the National Socialists of Germany as a justification for the present atrocities that are being committed in Ukraine, in Russia, in Gaza. So when you have something that is constantly used as a justification for crimes in the present, you eventually want to look at the original justification and see, well, are we being told everything that is accurate in the first place. So, when it comes to what the cause of the Second World War was, it doesn't seem Murray is such a weasel. Punching jelly is funny because it's the analogy he uses to talk about Dave Smith, but that's actually what it is when it comes to debating someone like Douglas Murray. The general claim is the West, meaning Britain, France, and the United States, had no option but to declare war against National Socialist Germany. In fact, it was Germany that declared war against America on December 11th of 1941. And the reason this was justified is because the National Socialists were going to take over the world. They were going to violate people's rights in the process. And according to Piers Morgan, we would all be speaking German. As if once you colonize a place, it's worth getting everyone to start changing whatever language they speak. Completely ridiculous. If we look at Neville Chamberlain's original justification for what the declaration of war was, this would have been September 3rd of 1939. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, the one who declared war, actually said this was a result of the National Socialists' violation of Polish independence. They invaded a town called Danzig, which was 95% German. 20 years previously, this had been a city under German rule. The government of Britain at the time, headed by Neville Chamberlain, said, "This is a bridge too far. We're now going to have to declare war against National Socialist Germany." In response, the National Socialists ended up France declared war along with Britain in this war for Polish independence against National Socialist Germany. So let's just pause right there, look at the original justification by the prime minister in charge, and then look at what happened after the war. You had 7 million dead Poles, roughly, and you had Poland under Bolshevik occupation, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of Frenchmen who died, the 900,000 British people who died, the 400,000 Americans, the 8 million German civilians, the 8 million German troops, and the 600,000 German civilians that died as a cause of result of J.M. Spate, the principal air secretary of the ministry, authorizing a dehousing program in Germany. This is referred to as the Lindemann program, where they intentionally targeted houses that were middle class in hopes of putting Germany in such a dire situation that it would just cause the National Socialist regime to start waving the white flag. So we have the original intention. We're fighting them to preserve Polish independence. Now, decades later, they have a new justification, which was we were trying to save the Jews of Europe. So we can already tell that there's something fishy about this. Also, we have 7 million dead Poles in the war for Polish independence, not too unsimilar to the First World War, where the British were backing the French government in opposition to Kaiser Wilhelm. This war for French independence led to, I want to say, 3 million French deaths. Could that be right? It might be, I'm sorry, I want to say 1.3 million French deaths. It might have been 3 million wounded as a cause result of the First World War. Few things to keep in mind. You have to look at the costs as well as the benefits when it comes to warfare. So if you say, well, we can't let another country, invade some other territory. Well, it's not that. The goal is for another country to enter a certain geographical area and murder those people for the sake of murdering them. It's much more profitable for governments to invade a country, occupy it, and more or less enslave and have a monopoly on violence in that geographical area. If you took this consistently, if violation of independence was a real justification to start wars, well, then we'd have to go to war on behalf of people in the Donbass who are fighting against the regime in Kiev. We'd have to go to war on behalf of the people in Texas who want their independence from the government in Washington, D.C. So once you realize the costs of war are extraordinarily high and the outcomes are extraordinarily uncertain, you're immediately weary of everything else that the state uses to justify these theft funded enslavement mass murder campaigns. If you're in Ukraine, according to the no leave declaration from Zelensky, I want to say this was February 24th of 2022, where all men ages 18 to 65, it was eventually extended to, could not leave, and the vast majority up to age 50 were subject to military conscription. This is the worst form of forced labor, the greatest exploitation of the working class that is imaginable. And so much of it is used, not because people have looked into the regime in Kiev and said, it's much better the people of Ukraine answer to this regime headed by Zelensky instead of if Yanukovych had still been in there. They don't look at that. They say, well, the Second World War was such a blatant case of good and evil that's probably similar to today. It shares a similarity, warfare then, warfare now. So I just got to find the Hitler, and then I can start advocating mass murder in either direction, depending on who the good guy is that day. So realizing that the Second World War, the original justification was Polish independence, and the costs that the people of Poland had to bear for that war, leaving half of Europe, Eastern Europe, under all Bolshevik occupation. So when people like Niall Ferguson will say, well, you never should have given the Sudetenland, 1/5 of Czechoslovakia, to Germany. The Bolsheviks ended up occupying all of Czechoslovakia after the war, not to mention East Germany, all the way to Vladivostok, and had an alliance with Chairman Mao, and had a colony in North Korea, and had troops in North Vietnam. So there's always downsides. President Herbert Hoover wrote a book in 1953, Freedom Betrayed, where he said, we shouldn't have asked for unconditional surrender to the Japanese because then they lost their colonies in Korea and Vietnam, which created a power vacuum for the Bolsheviks in those areas, which led to the US fighting a war in Korea and in Vietnam. We have to look at all the downsides. We have to determine whether or not it's actually worth going to war, risking your life, and getting your limbs blown off to oppose certain regimes. We have a government that violates our rights constantly. Every time we give them more money, they look for another justification to expand the size and scope of government. These are the ones explicitly violating our freedoms all the time. And we have to be worried about hypothetical freedoms in Tehran and Beijing and Moscow, while completely turning a blind eye to the domestic imperialism that's happening right before us. So that is why the Second World War is so vitally important. This was not a tale of good versus evil, or if it was a tale of good versus evil, it was the good civilians and good soldiers of every nation versus the evil psychopathic politicians playing them off as pawns.
Keith, fantastic answer. And I guess, I always get a kick out of the fact that, these neocons always try to shove every world problem and make it fit into the bots of the Second World War. And then when you go to Ukraine, you have one side that worships Stefan Bandera, a Nazi collaborator during the Second World War. And we end up on that side of the conflict. But that'll do it for our time today. Everybody, Keith Knight, the managing editor of the Libertarian Institute. His show is Don't Tread on Anyone. Check it out, subscribe, and follow him on X at @An_capitalist. And of course, you could help out this show just by subscribing. Head on over to our YouTube channel and help us hit that 1,000 subscriber mark. Thanks, everyone. We'll be back with another show on Wednesday.